Thanks so much for joining us. We're a small group today. I think we've got a lot of folks who are out on vacation, but we are recording the session. So if there are folks on your team who weren't able to join us this morning, the session will be recorded and posted to the CoC's YouTube channel as always. So I'm Lauren Peretti. I'm joined this morning by my colleague, Howard Birchman, and Howard and I are from Housing Innovations. And I think as most of you probably know, we are a training and consulting firm, and we work with continuums of care all around the country. We've been doing that work with CoCs for several decades, and Howard is the person on our team who works most closely with the Rhode Island CoC. Today's session is on policy and administrative requirements, not a super sexy topic, we know. And luckily, we promise it won't be as heart-wrenching as our last session on navigating uncertain times. So we're going to be referencing recent changes at the federal level also in today's session. So any editorializing that Howard and I might do during the discussion reflects our personal opinions. It does not reflect any official position of the Rhode Island CoC or of Rhode Island Housing. So before we get started, a couple other quick housekeeping things. We love for you guys to speak up during these sessions, ask questions at any time. You don't have to wait for us to prompt you. You can literally just unmute and start talking. You can raise your hand, or you can use the comments or the Q&A features in Teams. And please, 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 if you've got something to say, don't be shy. We love to be able to see everyone. So if you haven't already and you are feeling camera ready this morning, please turn on your cameras. I think Sarah's going to get the slides uploaded into chat momentarily if she has not already. We know that some people have had technical issues using the polls. So if you logged in using the Teams app, you can try logging in instead using your browser. And if you are unable to access the polls, no worries. You can either just think to yourself about what you think the answers can be, or if you don't mind your answers not being anonymous, you can put them in chat, and we will talk about the answers together as a group. And we are scheduled to be together this morning for 2 hours. I think we will get through all of our content, although we might not cover every bullet on every slide, and the slides are available to you as always for reference. So this is our agenda for today. We're going to talk about just the framework of federal and local policies and regulations that underpin the requirements that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about making sure that our programs are providing services equitably and offering equal access to all different diverse folks. We'll talk about reasonable accommodations. We'll talk about a topic that is near and dear to both Howard and I's hearts, which is co-housing people together with their pets. We'll also talk about making sure programs are accessible to people with disabilities. We'll talk about the educational rights that participants in these programs have, about the Buy America preference, which might be new. That's a reasonably recent requirement, and then just some other CoC administrative requirements, and then written policies that your agencies are required to have. And as always, we will wrap up and answer any questions that we didn't get to during the presentation. So before we get started, we're not such a big group today, but still I think too many people to go around and have folks introduce themselves individually. But we do love to see, and think it's good for you guys to see, who among your colleagues is with us. So if you would just take a moment and share in the chat what agency you're with, what your role is at that agency, where you are working in Rhode Island, your location. And then we like to start these trainings off with something positive, and so something that makes you smile. And while you are working on getting that information into the chat, I will just share that a thing that makes me smile, particularly in the summer, is being out on a paddleboard, a lake with my puppies. So let's see what other folks are saying. So we've got your dog. Yay, we're going to talk a lot about pets today. 3-day weekends, that makes me smile too. I think we probably all have that in common. The beach, also, I am also a huge fan of the beach. So, all right, well, thanks guys for helping us to start this off on a positive note. So on a less positive note, there are really quite a lot of requirements for CoC programs, and that is fundamentally, I think, the reason why Rhode Island Housing, your CoC, has convened this series of trainings, right? It's a lot for people to understand and know, and so these trainings are really intended to make it easier for you and your teams to understand all of what is required of you and to follow those requirements. So most of the requirements in the CoC projects come from the federal government, right? So the first two bullets here, the CoC program interim rule, and then 2 CFR Part 200, right? Those are our federal documents. And so the CoC program interim rule really establishes the regulations for the CoC program specifically, and then Part 200 establishes fiscal requirements for not just the CoC program, but for other types of federal funding. And then the third bullet here are the written policies that are established locally by your Rhode Island CoC. Now, these are long, dense documents, and I think no one expects you to read them cover to cover, but we've linked them here in case they are helpful. When you have a question, they can be a good resource to look something up. But that said, they are not always, particularly the federal documents, are not always super user-friendly. It can be hard to find what you need in there. So always feel free to reach out to the team at Rhode Island Housing or to us at Housing Innovations if you ever have any questions related to the requirements for the CoC program. And our contact information, as well as the Rhode Island Housing team's contact information, is one of the last slides in the deck today. And it's actually in all of the slide deck, so you have that information handy. So, obviously, there have been a lot of recent attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion coming out of the federal government. And so particularly at this time, and also, right, really attacks on immigrants, right, on our neighbors who happen to have been born outside of the United States. So always, and particularly at this moment in time, it's really critical that our CoC programs are working proactively to address all sorts of inequalities that we know make it more likely that BIPOC and LGBTQ plus folks makes it more likely for them to experience homelessness than it is for straight, white, or cisgender people, right? So our programs are serving a very diverse population, and it's really our job to ensure that our services are affirming and effective for everyone, even when protections may be being rolled back by the federal government. So that brings us here. So there has long been a requirement in the CoC program. It's established in the CoC program interim rule that every agency that is either a recipient or a subrecipient of CoC funds needs to have at least one person with lived experience of homelessness on your board of directors, or, and this is HUD's language, an equivalent policymaking entity. So I think, there was a time back ago, right, when many agencies, rather than putting someone directly on their board of directors, would establish client advisory committees. And HUD has really said that that is not a suitable substitution, right? So when HUD says an equivalent policy-making entity, they have interpreted that to mean that it has to be an entity that can establish policy without being overruled by the board. And that's not usually the way an advisory committee works, right? So it can't be a group that just has an advisory role. It has to be an actual policy-making entity. And so I think in effect, what that means is that the board is normally, right, the body that makes policy for your agencies. So it really is having somebody with lived experience of homelessness on your board of directors. In past CoC competitions, HUD has really emphasized that they are looking for involvement of people with more recent lived experience of homelessness. So they have defined that as within the past 7 years. We don't know what HUD is going to do in the upcoming competition, but regardless of whatever changes HUD might have, the requirement to have somebody on your board is established in the program, in the CoC program interim rule. So regardless of what happens in the competition, that will remain the requirement until such time as they promulgate a new rule, which they are very, very slow about doing. So, and importantly, right, I think we all kind of, really hold dear the value of elevating voices of people with lived experience. And so even if HUD changes that rule, right, I'm sure all of you are going to want to continue to ensure that your programs and your policies are informed by the lived expertise of people who have actually experienced homelessness. The last thing I'll say about this is that the requirement is to have just one person on your board, but I think both so that no one person feels like they're shouldering a lot of responsibility, too much responsibility, and also to help ensure that when someone steps down from your board, right, you can continue to meet the requirement. We usually recommend that agencies have at least 2 people on their board with lived experience of homelessness. All right. So we also need to make sure, right, that everyone, including but not limited to LGBTQ plus folks, feels safe and included in our programs. So we know, I'm sure you've seen this regularly, especially if you're doing street outreach work, that people will choose to stay on the streets if they don't feel safe in our programs. And we also know that creating a space that feels safe to people is not just about the physical space, right? It's not just about security. It's about, what people see in our programs, what they hear, how they're treated, and that creating that truly safe space has to be intentional, right? It has to be something that program leaders and staff at all levels are really working hard every day to achieve, right? So it includes things like making sure that we're modeling respectful behavior and appropriate language, right? So using people's chosen pronouns, making sure that people know that they are welcomed and that you take their needs seriously, and importantly, that you don't tolerate bigotry, right? So if there is any kind of harassment or bullying that occurs, it's really important for people to know and to trust that you're going to stop it, and that in doing so, you're going to really focus your attention on the perpetrator and not on the victim. So meaning that you're going to you're not going to make the person who has been victimized do something differently. So you're not going to say to someone who's the victim of bullying, oh, well, you should move to a different, place in the program, right? Rather, you're going to focus on the person who is the perpetrator of that harassment and bullying. It's also really important to post signage that signals to people that they can be themselves in your space, and also having it be visible in your space through literature and et cetera, that you partner with other organizations in the community that can also provide affirming resources for folks. All right. So talk a little bit now about fair housing. So this is another place, right, where recently we have seen some rolling back of the federal government's commitment to fair housing. But it's important for everyone to remember that despite what you're seeing in the news, right, housing discrimination is still illegal in America. And so the basics of fair housing remain the same, right? That law has not been repealed. You cannot deny housing to anyone because of their race, their color, their national origin, their sex, their religion, their family status, or their disability. Those are the classes that are protected by the federal fair housing requirements. And then you in Rhode Island are also lucky to have state level law that, in addition to those folks, also protects people based upon their marital status, their sexual orientation, their gender identity, their age, and their status as a DV survivor. So what has happened is HUD has signaled that they are withdrawing what is known as the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule. But again, that concept of affirmatively furthering fair housing remains in the Fair Housing Act statute. So unless they change the statute, affirmatively furthering fair housing remains the law. And so what that means is that if an agency, like all of you, are receiving federal funds for housing, that you've got to operate your programs in a way that goes beyond just not discriminating against people and actually promotes fair housing opportunities, right? So examples of that can include things like making sure you're providing fair housing training to your staff, making sure you're notifying clients of their fair housing rights, making sure you're posting information at your sites related to fair housing, educating landlords about their fair housing obligations, right? So if a landlord says something that is not legal, that is illegal housing discrimination, you should be reminding landlords about what their fair housing obligations are. And you really should be reporting any fair housing violations that you encounter. At this point, right, because of the stance that HUD has taken, that the federal government has taken around fair housing, it's probably going to be more effective to report those violations at the state level rather than to HUD. So HUD has basically said that they're going to be promulgating a new, actually, no, I think they did already promulgate a new proposed rule. Am I right about that, Howard? So many things going on, I can't keep track, but I think this is actually a proposed rule that has been promulgated. And basically what it says is that rather than doing all of the things that used to be delineated out in the rule that were requirements under the affirmatively furthering fair housing, portion of the Fair Housing Act, now basically the new rule kind of says that you can just certify that you have taken steps that are rationally related to promoting fair housing. So it's a kind of self-report system under the new rule. So that said, so you've got a great organization locally in Rhode Island. It's called Rhode Island Fair Housing. I'm sure you're all familiar with them. And these folks are really your local experts on fair housing. So if you have questions about what is a fair housing violation or is not a fair housing violation, they would be a great resource. They've got some FAQs and some resources that are linked here on this slide that you can check out. Sadly, their federal funding to support their work and similar work that's being done by agencies all around the country for fair housing is under attack in the budget. We talked about that last time when we did the Navigating Uncertainty webinar. So if you think that the federal government should continue to be committed to fair housing, then we've added a link here to this slide to some action alerts from the National Fair Housing Alliance that you can use to advocate to ensure that we are continuing to fund fair housing activities as a country. So here we're going to talk again. So Howard covered this in last week's session, but it is really important. So I just wanted to repeat it quickly here. So legal immigration status has never been an eligibility criterion of the CoC program, and that has not changed. Fortunately, also, what has not changed is under the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunities Reconciliation Act, or PROWORA, right? Nonprofits are still exempt from the requirements in PROWORA to verify immigration status. But as Howard discussed last week, we also had this ruling by the DOJ that certain types of programs, including shelters and outreach and transitional housing and rapid rehousing, those programs also used to, or for another 10 days still, did not have to verify immigration status, even when the recipient was a government agency. Unfortunately, the Department of Justice has now withdrawn those exceptions, and so those changes are taking effect later this month on August 15th. So basically what this means is that where the recipient or subrecipient agency of a CoC grant is not a nonprofit, you're going to very soon need to verify immigration status to be in compliance. So if you are a nonprofit recipient of CoC funds, though, you do remain exempt from doing that. And as Howard said last time, that exemption is in the PERWORA law. So it is not something that DOJ unilaterally can change. They would have to get Congress to pass a new law in order to change that. So we always suggest that you only collect information about the people that you are serving that is necessary for you to collect, right? So if you're a nonprofit and you are collecting information about immigration status, that is not necessary if your CoC program is the recipient of your grant funds, and we strongly suggest that you don't do it. So, and then if you missed the session that we did last week, Howard also reviewed some important information about steps your programs can take to protect people who may not have documented immigration status. So check that out if you missed it. There's some good resources there that you can use. All right. So I think we are going to do.
There's a question, Lauren.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Hi. What's
Hi.
the question, Kristen?
Sorry, thanks. So I just wanted to ask so you said 10 more days or whatever, August 15th is when that exemption doesn't take place anymore. Is that then for going forward, or what about retroactively? Like if you already have, clients in a program, does the fact that they took that exemption away affect being able to serve them?
It's a good question, Kristen. And Howard, I'll pause if you have an answer to it. Otherwise, I'll say about how we're trying to get an answer to it.
Lauren is right. I mean, it's a very good question. We're not really seeing what we know going forward. You cannot enroll people, but we don't know what it means, what you need to do, and there'll be further guidance on that.
Yeah. I reached out to our HUD representative in Boston, in the Boston office, and she said that she hasn't received any direction on that yet. But knowing that, this is 10 days away, it would be great to get some guidance. Yeah. But, okay. So, well, thanks.
For another CoC that we work with, we have reached out to Manat. They're a law firm. You guys probably know them. And that's one of the many questions that we've asked about this and some of the other changes. And when we get that guidance, we will share it with you all. All right. So are there any other questions before we move on to the poll? Thanks for the question, Kristen. Really good question. So for this poll, it's really asking you a series of questions, and for each of the practices listed in the poll, we're asking you to say, and remember, this is anonymous, whether your agency has fully implemented the practice, begun implementation of the practice, not begun yet, or you might not be sure because you might not be the person at your agency who is responsible for this. So we'll give you a few minutes to click through. There are 3 questions here, and then we'll review together. Right, we'll give it a couple more seconds for people to get their answers in. All right, Rosa, you want to close the poll and we will review the responses. Thanks, Rosa. All right. So it looks like in terms of making sure that people with lived experience of homelessness you've got somebody on your board of directors. About half of you have fully implemented the practice. So if you don't do that, it is something that we have seen HUD issue a finding on during monitoring. And of course, it's just important for making sure that our programs are informed by that expertise. So you'll want to make sure that there's a plan in place to get somebody on your board as quickly as possible. Then for the second question here, so the requirement is not just that you have somebody on your board, but also that you are engaging people in other ways in your program. So, one of the primary ways is really by employing people that have lived expertise. And so that's certainly a great way to do it. Surveying people in your programs is another way. And it looks like fewer folks feel like this practice has been fully implemented, just 25%, but 75% of you are saying that either you've begun or fully implemented this practice. And then lastly, my agency has visible materials that communicate all are welcome here. And it looks like 75% of you are definitely doing this. So, all right, thanks, everybody. So in addition, in terms of making sure that we are, not discriminating against folks in our programs, you are federally required, if you are a recipient or subrecipient of CoC funds, to have written policies that indicate that you are in full compliance with all federal non-discrimination laws. And so that includes fair housing, it includes equal opportunity in housing and employment, and it includes making sure that you've got a policy that your policy addresses your obligations to make reasonable accommodations. And we'll talk about reasonable accommodations more in a minute. You also need a written policy that says that you don't discriminate against people on the basis of religion. When we monitor, we often see that agencies have non-discrimination policies that cover their employment practices, but that you don't have non-discrimination policies that cover how your intake practices and also how you serve people once they are enrolled in your program. So you want to make sure that you have both of those things, both on the employment side and on the services side. And then again, that those written policies include fair housing, reasonable accommodations, and not discriminating against people on the basis of religion. So HUD has these rules. They're called the Equal Access Rules. There are two of them. One was promulgated in 2012. The other was promulgated in 2016. Both of these equal access rules currently remain in effect, but HUD has announced that they are no longer going to be enforcing the 2016 rule, and that's the one that ensures equal access to programs based on people's gender identity. So, but even though they have said they're not going to enforce it, the rule is still currently in effect, although we suspect that they will certainly be making efforts to discontinue that rule. So as it stands currently, right, all programs have to be open to eligible individuals and families, regardless of sexual orientation, regardless of gender identity, and regardless of marital status. And HUD has this very lovely definition of family and basically says that, the people that we serve get to decide for themselves who is a part of their family, right? So that means that you should serve people who present together and say, we are a family as a family, regardless of whether or not they're married, regardless of whether or not there is any blood relationship. So you also cannot separate members of a household based on gender or age, right? So you can't say this program only serves women and children, or this program only serves boys up to age 12 or 14, right? None of that is allowable. And those are all under the 2012 rule, which HUD plans to continue. And then if your project serves any families with children, you have to serve all families with children, right? So you can say we are a program that serves singles only, although we'll talk about that in a minute. But you cannot say that we are a program that serves only women and children, right? So if you serve any families, you have to serve all families. So that includes, dads and their kids, that includes same-sex couples and their kids, that includes grandmoms and their grandchildren, right? It goes back to the definition. People get to define for themselves who is a member of their family. And as it currently stands, you also have to place and serve individuals in accordance with how they identify, right, in terms of their gender identity. So if you run a shelter or other kind of sex segregated program and you get HUD funds, if someone identifies as a woman, you are required to serve her in your women's shelter. It doesn't matter what her ID or her birth certificate says. So HUD definitely recognizes that people's life circumstances change, right? So somebody that's, came into the program, your single adult program, might get pregnant and have a baby. Or sometimes somebody that came into your family program might either lose custody of their children, or those children go to live with someone different in the family and are no longer in the household. So HUD says that you are allowed to accommodate those changes, and we hope that you are accommodating those changes. So what HUD has said is, in your project application, you say this is a program that serves families, or this is a program that serves households without children, and that you need a grant agreement amendment if you're going to change that. But what HUD has said is that changing that doesn't mean that, one woman in your program got pregnant and now has a kid, right? So as long as you're still, as long as you're serving a limited number of households that are different than the target population that you put in your project application, you don't need a grant agreement amendment, right? If you are going to switch wholesale, right, from serving families to serving singles, then you're going to need a grant agreement amendment. But just accommodating life of your participants does not require you to have a grant agreement amendment. All right. Questions about that before I move us on to a different topic? Okay. So now I'm going to get to show you a picture of my baby. This is Gracie. And she is one of my dogs, and she and her sisters are absolutely a part of my family. So if you are also a pet lover, if you have a pet in your life, either your pet or maybe someone else's pet, but a pet that you adore, please take a moment. We want to count heads here about everyone on that loves their pets. So just take a moment to put in the poll the name of the pet that you adore. You can tell us what kind of animal it is too. Lilo and Pepe, yay. Ruby and Ella. Gus, your dog. Oh, we've got a lot of pets in this is Howard. Crosby, Callie, Carter, and Cyrus. Howard has 4 dogs. Kylo, Callie, a golden retriever, yay, right? So, we know that many of our clients feel the same way that we do about their pets. So, to truly understand and meet the needs of a client that has pets, we have to understand that those pets are an integral part of that person's family, the same way that my pets and your pets are an integral part of our families. So we're going to talk now about both requirements and best practices related to reasonable accommodations and to co-housing people together with their pets. So we'll start with reasonable accommodations. So a reasonable accommodation really at its most basic level is just a request that a person with a disability asks for something for you to do differently, something that's outside of your usual practice that they need because of their disability to enable them to be successful in your program, right? So an example of that would be someone with a disability needs an assistance animal to help her to manage her symptoms of anxiety, but your program doesn't normally accommodate pets, right? That's just one example. There are many kinds of reasonable accommodations that have nothing to do with pets. There's some others that are listed here on this slide. And I'll just go through one other example. If someone has a disability and needs to live on a bus line to enable them to get the care that they need for that disability, and that unit is more expensive than your usual payment standard for a unit, then paying that higher amount could also be a reasonable accommodation. So that's an example that does not involve pets. A couple things to keep in mind about reasonable accommodations. You should be proactively listening for people who are asking for a reasonable accommodation, even when they don't use the words, I need a reasonable accommodation, and when they don't put that request in writing. So if someone tells you they need something different for your program to do it because they have a disability, right, and they need that thing in order to accommodate their disability, that's a reasonable accommodation request. And it doesn't matter whether they said reasonable accommodation, and it doesn't matter whether they put it in writing or not. You should be honoring your obligations to evaluate and hopefully approve that reasonable accommodation request. The other thing to keep in mind is where you are going to ask for documentation of that disability. The documentation requirements really follow the same rules we use for disability verification in the permanent supportive housing program. So it does not have to be a doctor who is, providing that documentation. It can be any professional that's licensed to diagnose and treat that disability. So for example, a social worker can verify a disability for someone that has a mental health or a substance use disorder if that social work is licensed, because those licensures cover those diagnosing and treating those kinds of disabilities, right? So again, it does not have to be, the documentation does not have to come from a doctor. And you should accommodate the request if possible. So the only circumstances in which you're not required to make an accommodation is if it would present, and this is HUD's language, an undue financial or administrative burden or cause a fundamental alteration in your program. So an example of that would be someone says that, because of their disability, they need you to provide them with a full-time nurse. Obviously, that's going to be an undue financial burden, right? You don't have the money in your budget to provide full-time nursing. You're also not a skilled nursing facility, so you would not be required to accommodate such a request. Another example would be if your project is fully spent, right? You don't have any money available in your budget, and somebody asks for a higher payment standard to live on that bus route, as I talked about earlier, that would be a reason. If you didn't have any other funding available, that would be a reason to deny a request. But hopefully, in most cases, when somebody makes a reasonable accommodation request, you should be able to approve those requests and really look for ways to screen people in, right? How can we approve this request rather than looking for reasons to deny the request? So I am not going to go through all of this, but this is a flow chart. It's, I think, a useful tool that you can use to determine when somebody wants to live together with their animal, what your obligations are, right? So is it a service animal? Is it an assistance animal? Or is it a pet? So if it is a service animal, such as a trained seeing eye dog, you are required to allow that service animal in your housing program. You are also required to make reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities who need an assistance animal to alleviate a symptom of their disability. You are not required necessarily to permit pets in your housing programs, but doing so really increasingly is recognized as a best practice and also as a critical component of trauma-informed care, and we'll talk about that more on the next slide. But this tool, this decision tree that you can use to determine service animal, assistance animal, or pet is linked here in green at the top of this slide. And then at the bottom of this slide, there's another really helpful tool from HUD that you can use when somebody has made a reasonable accommodation request for an assistance animal to help you determine which you must approve and which it might be allowable not to approve. Although, as I said earlier, in most cases, unless it's an undue financial or administrative burden, you are going to be required to approve those requests. And it's really good to approve those requests. And we're going to talk about that now, right? So about 66% of households in America have pets, and that is a reality that the human service system largely ignores. So sadly, people's relationships with their pets are largely either invisible to our system, or we treat pets as a barrier and not as a member of the family. So increasingly, as I said, there's really recognition in our sector that our system will never be trauma informed until co-sheltering people and co-housing people together with their pets is the norm in our system. And there really is this growing body of scientific evidence, of research that demonstrates that pets are good for people, right? They're good for people's physical health, they're good for our mental health, they're good for our social health. And we know from science, right, that interactions with pets, whether they're our pets or someone else's pets, increase these chemicals in our brains that are good for us, right? Dopamine, endorphins, oxytocin. We also know from research that that interaction reduces our cortisol, which is the stress hormone, right? So we know that pets release these chemicals that are good for us. And we also know that people who have pets, right, demonstrate better heart health, they're less prone to depression. Interaction with pets can actually improve blood pressure, reduce anxiety. So there's all of this science that tells us that pets are beneficial for us as well as for the people that we serve. And then, beyond that, we know, I'm sure you've seen it in your practice, that many of our clients, their bonds with their pets are very, very deep. For some folks that we work with, their pet is the most important relationship in their life. And so, just as with my family, and, for all of you that listed the pets that you love in the chat, right, people will put their own safety at risk and even their lives at risk to ensure the safety of their pets. And so if we're not meeting the needs of people together with their pets, we are actually putting our clients at risk. And we know that when we separate clients from their pets, it's traumatic. There's research that shows that separation can trigger bereavement, and it can even increase that somebody will hurt themselves. So again, if your intent is to be a trauma-informed program, you probably want to look at, if you haven't already, what you can do to increase co-housing and co-sheltering opportunities for your clients. And the good news is that there's help to do this, right? There are projects all around the country that are already successfully co-housing and co-sheltering people with their pets. And we know from some of the reviews that have been done by these programs that the fears that prevent many agencies from doing this don't play out when programs actually start doing it, right? So we know from projects that are co-sheltering and co-housing that bites, which is often the fear that we hear most often, are very, very, very rare. There's also can sometimes be a fear that if we start, accepting pets into our programs, welcoming pets into our programs, that we're going to be flooded with pets in our programs. And that just isn't the reality when you look at programs that have done it. In one review that's linked here on this slide of pet-friendly shelters, only about 5 to 10% of the clients at the shelters had animals. The other thing we can learn from programs that are already doing this is that the benefits are really very widely acknowledged, even among staff that were resistant to the idea to begin with. So what they see is that being responsible for that animal really helps people to take care of themselves, right? So knowing that I'm responsible to, feed my dog and to make sure that my dog is safe can really help someone, can really help motivate someone to either accept housing or maybe to stay sober enough that they can get home and take care of that pet. They know that that pet needs a walk. They know that that pet needs to be fed. And so it can actually help people, to engage in more healthy behaviors for themselves. And we know that, that responsibility really is good for people and can help both people and pets thrive, because we also know that pets thrive when they can stay together with their people. So, and then, as I said, I'm sorry, I just want to go back here real quick because I don't think I said this. So My Dog is My Home is this fantastic organization, and they are really a great resource to help people, to help programs figure out how you can be welcoming pets into your programs. And so you don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? There are a ton of homelessness response programs, particularly on the West Coast, although increasingly as well on the East Coast, that are already co-housing and co-sheltering. They've already developed lots of policies and procedures, and you can borrow from all of that good work that they have already done. And we have linked here, this slide, some sample policies that you can just adapt in order to make this happen also at your programs. So, all right, a few more slides here before I pass it off to Howard. So you are also required to ensure that your CoC programs are accessible to people with whatever kind of disability, mobility impairments, vision impairments, hearing, cognitive disabilities, etc. So that obviously includes the things like making sure that your physical plant at your facilities can accommodate people with mobility impairments, so that if there are steps, right, there are ramps to enter, your bathrooms are accessible. But it also includes things that people might not think of as commonly. So it requires you to be able to communicate effectively with people with disabilities who are applying to your programs, who are getting help from your programs, and even members of the public who are trying to get information about what your agency provides, right? You are required to do certain things in order to communicate effectively with those folks. So this means, if you've got somebody that needs ASL interpretation, that you've got a way that you can provide that, or if you've got somebody that has a vision impairment and needs written materials in Braille, that you accommodate that. And it might even mean, like, when you start to talk about cognitive disabilities or mental health disabilities that impact people's cognition, that if you've got a meeting where you're going over information for people and somebody's struggling to understand, that you've got a staff person there who's able to help somebody who that struggles to be able to fully engage in that meeting and understand the content and be an active participant. So it also means that you've got to ensure that all of the electronic documents that you use, and that includes both your website and any electronic documents, Microsoft Word documents, Excel documents, etc., that you use, have to be accessible to staff with disabilities, with visual disabilities, to participants, and to members of the public. And so basically, what that means is that a lot of people with visual impairments use these screen readers, right? So that if they can't see the document or the website in order to be able to read it themselves, there's this technology that reads out loud to them. And in order for that technology to work, the document or the website has to be formatted in a particular way. So the good news is that there are built-in features in the Microsoft Office suite that enable you to do that. So what it means is that when you're creating documents, for example, in Word, right, rather than formatting things manually, you want to use the built-in features that are already in Word. So for example, instead of, creating manually, your headers, you want to use the headers feature in Word, right? Instead of, manually doing bullets, you want to use the bullets feature in Word. Word also has this accessibility feature. It's in the tools menu. So if you go into tools in Words, there's this thing that says check accessibility, and you can click on that and it will tell you if there are any accessibility issues in your document, and then it'll tell you how to correct those issues. So this also means that for your website, right, your agency's website, if you have not already had someone do an accessibility review of your website. You want to make sure that the folks at your agency who are adding new content to your website, who are building your website, that there's been an accessibility review. There are consultants that you can hire to do this if you don't have the skill set already at your agency, but that someone needs to review to make sure your website is compatible with these screen reader features. And it's not just about reviewing it once, it's about making sure that as you're adding content, you're continuing to ensure the accessibility of that content. So, all right, I'm going to pause and see if we have any questions. 3 questions here again. Can an agency have a client advisory committee instead of a person with lived experience of homelessness on your board? Are both recipient and subrecipient agencies required to ensure accessibility of electronic documents? And then finally, is it always illegal to deny a request for a reasonable accommodation? So we'll give you a few minutes to answer these questions, and then we will go over them together. All right, we have 4 responses, which is, I think, the same number of responses that we had in the last poll. And I think probably some people don't have access. So I think, Rosa, you can close the poll, share the results, and we will go over them. All right. So the first question, can an agency have a client advisory committee instead of a person with lived experience of homelessness on your board? 75% of you got that correct. The answer to that is no, right? So an advisory committee will not suffice because it is not a policy-making entity. So you need to have a person with lived experience of homelessness on your board, probably, unless you've got another entity that is the entity responsible for making policy for your programs. The next question, are both recipient and subrecipient agencies required to ensure accessibility of electronic documents? And you all got that question right. The answer to that is yes. That is your responsibility of both recipients and subrecipients. And then finally, is it always illegal to deny a request for reasonable accommodation? And you all got that correct as well. You can deny a reasonable accommodation when it would be an undue financial burden or a financial or administrative burden are the 2 most common reasons. Okay, so I am going to turn it over to Howard.
Okay, and I am here. Hi, everybody. Let's get going here. So the first, what we're going to start talking about is the Violence Against Women Act protections that are available to all participants. And remember, we've said this many times, but although overwhelmingly domestic violence affects women, it is not exclusively or restricted to that. So it's really against violence against humans. Everyone is protected against domestic violence in these programs. And as we know that domestic abuse or violence often can take the form of physical abuse, it can take the form of psychological or emotional abuse, and it can take the form of financial abuse as well. And on top of that, oftentimes when someone is the victim of that abuse or the part of that process often involves the engagement of law enforcement entities. It's not unusual when law enforcement is involved for them to basically take legal action against both participants, even though one clearly is the victim and the other is not. But sometimes it's difficult for those responding officers to make that determination. So it is entirely possible that people who are both experiencing victimization because they've got an abusive partner, spouse, significant other, are also harmed because of sort of collateral effects of that. If there is an arrest that is made, then it is likely that that person who's also being abused could also end up with some kind of a criminal background, which could get in the way of their housing. It is not unusual for abuse to take the form of financial abuse, which means that the person who is being abused can end up with extremely poor credit or other things that can make it difficult. And sometimes, although it should not happen, the entire household will get evicted as a result of frequent contact with police or other authorities as a result of domestic abuse or violence, and that can lead to a negative housing history, which make it very difficult for folks to get housing and other things. And the goal here of these VAWA protections is to not deny support or assistance people solely on the basis of the fact that they were really victimized, and that is why they are in that situation. And again, you cannot deny people because they are a survivor. You cannot deny them based on, again, if their credit history, their job history. Sometimes people can lose employment because of the effect of their abuser. And as I said, oftentimes it'll have a negative impact on people's criminal history. And also, if somebody is a victim, a survivor of abuse, they cannot be evicted from their unit based on the actions of their abuser. They cannot be claimed that they are part of a housing situation that is deleterious to the other residents there. So there are a lot of protections for folks to make sure that these collateral impacts of being a survivor are not impacting their ability to obtain or maintain their housing. Now, there are a number of rights. Basically, what I've talked about are a lot of the occupancy rights that people have, and people, for a variety of reasons, should be informed on repeated occasions as to what those rights are. First, one is because especially people who are experiencing traumatic events may block out those other pieces of information. So it's really important to reiterate what those rights are. So basically, people need to be provided with a written description of their occupancy rights under the Violence Against Women Act when they're admitted to any CoC housing or when they start to receive assistance. You have to provide that information again if they are denied assistance. You have to provide that assistance if you ever provide them with a notice of eviction or termination of assistance. Again, that is these are times when people can have those rights, and basically you need to give these notices to each adult member of the household at each of these times. And again, if we want to make sure that we're giving this information to all adult members of the household, it's possible. If it was just given to the abuser, that information would not be passed on to their victims or the people who are surviving from that assistance. So again, you need to provide these two things, both the occupancy rights, which tells people what their rights, and their incident certification. Remember, it is entirely permissible for a victim to basically, they are the ones who determine that they are not safe. The victims determine that they need additional assistance, and that is solely at their determination. So the emergency transfer is a really, really important right that folks have under the Violence Against Women Act. And basically what we're talking about is if you have any situation where the survivor feels that they are unsafe, and they're, as I said before, they're allowed to solely make that determination. They are unsafe in that unit. They cannot remain there because they feel that they're faced with imminent harm. If you are so informed, you must make provisions to provide emergency transfer. Also, there's this other thing is if an actual sexual assault occurred on the premises within the past 90 days, then they have that right to an emergency transfer. The first thing in emergency transfer is to relocate them. Well, first of all, if it's a tenant-based rental assistance thing, you want to assist them to use that tenant-based rental assistance to both be able to get out of their lease at their current premises and be able to assume occupancy elsewhere in another location where they feel that it is safe. Also, solely, this is only the case where this is possible, but if you've got somebody who is a survivor of domestic violence and they basically feel that they are not going to be safe in the state of Rhode Island because, of course, we've got a statewide continuum of care. If they feel that there's no place in the state of Rhode Island because, as we know, it's not the largest state in the union, if they feel that they can't find a safe location in Rhode Island, then they are allowed, with CoC assistance, to find housing outside of the CoC in order to ensure that they are safety. If you have units available within your own project, you should first relocate them to another unit or help them find another unit using tenant-based rental assistance. If that is not possible, then basically they will be relocated to another project within the CoC, and they would have first priority in obtaining that assistance because they need to get that assistance. Okie dokie. So there's also, as I sort of implied before, it is a requirement that all participants have this lease addendum that specifies these Violence Against Women Act protections. That is, if there is a need for an emergency transfer, the participant can break that lease in order to effectuate that emergency transfer. You cannot be denied housing or evicted solely because of the fact that people are a survivor. And also the provision under the lease addendum allows for a bifurcation, meaning that you can basically split the lease. You can basically have the abuser removed from the lease and allow the survivor to continue on occupancy in the unit with the abuser no longer being part of the lease. And if there are some certain circumstances, such as permanent supportive housing, where the abuser might be the person with disabilities, might be the one who qualified for the household for assistance. If that is the case and the remaining member of the household are no longer eligible under the component in which they're receiving assistance, you are allowed them to remain in that unit until the end of the lease term and continuing to receive assistance in that unit until the end of the lease term. So now these provisions had been part of the CoC program for a while. It was in 2022 in revisions that were made to the Violence Against Women Act that basically created two new sets of eligible activities under the Continual Care Program. Any organization that has a grant under the continual program are allowed to request funds for these two VAWA activities. The first one is facilitating and coordinating activities to ensure compliance with the emergency transfer plan requirement. I indicated before that people have that right to request an emergency transfer, but that is actually fairly complicated, requires a lot of steps to take in, and you can use these VAWA funds in order to assist people, and we're going to go in detail as to what those emergency transfer funding can allow you to do. It was these things were first made available in the 2023 competition. HUD said that any organization with a renewal grant could make that their own minor modification and shift up to 10% of the funds from one of their other budget lines into the VAWA funding category for emergency transfer, or the VAWA funding category for monitoring compliance with confidentiality. If it is a new grant, of course, you don't need to move funds into it. You can request funding from the get-go to assist you in VAWA compliance activities. So this is what you can pay for. And basically, under emergency transfer, you can pay for just basically most any need that a household will have. So you can pay for the cost of moving them from their unit to the unit they are going to. That could even, if you're moving them outside of the CoC, you can move them, cover the cost of that longer distance move. Similarly, if it is a longer distance and they have travel costs associated with going to that new location, you can pay for that travel cost. Obviously, we're talking about there being a new unit, so that will come with a new security deposit, could come with application and broker fees as well. Also, unusually and nicely under the Violence Against Women's Act, if one of the ways in which a household feels safe is because they've got a pet who also functions as a security device, you can cover the pet fees as part of the Violence Against Women Act. This technology to make units safe, so basically there are two sides of that. It could be things like doorbell cameras, other kinds of cameras on site that will give increased security. And if those things, which they need internet connections in order to function, you can cover both the doorbell camera and the cost of the internet if that is necessary in order to ensure safety. And of course, the case management strictly associated with all the work that's necessary in order to process, to locate another unit, which is what the housing navigation would be, and secure that landlord's cooperation with the move. All of that, these are all eligible costs. So again, folks should really consider, those are only going to be eligible costs if you have opened up that VAWA budget line for emergency transfers in your grant. This really is beneficial to your clients. So pay attention to the next time you get to renew your grant. You will get this opportunity to add the VAWA budget line to your grant. And if you've ever had a situation, or you came close to having a situation where you had a participant who needed to make an emergency transfer, that is a very, very useful tool to make sure you can really effectuate that transfer and maintain that household in safety. There's also there's another budget line for VAWA activities having to do with confidentiality confidentiality compliance. I see this used less regularly than we see the emergency transfer facilitation. I think that this would either be HMIS grants or coordinated entry grants that this is more likely, or sometimes perhaps, since we do have a highly respected DV agency in the state, sometimes that DV agency, which is also a recipient, might also take on this task of monitoring and evaluating compliance on VAWA confidentiality requirements. So these are all the eligible activities under that budget line. Switching away from the Violence Against Women Act for a moment, it is really encouraged that all recipients of assistance have some kind of a grievance process that's internal to the organization. It is very useful. It gives you great information about what is working and what is not working about your program. The other thing that can be beneficial about having a grievance process is it allows you to address those grievances within your own program, within your organization. It will mean that the participant doesn't have to go to someone else to get assistance. I mean, they can always express a grievance to HUD or other entities like that, but if they do that, it can come back and reverberate on your program. So it is beneficial, if you can, to give people the opportunity to grieve and to resolve those grievances internally. Again, it's, as it's saying here, it could present either more serious or disputes going up higher up the ladder, as it were, which can have harmful things. We know that if HUD hears complaints about a program, it will make them more likely to come and do a monitoring visit. So it can help forestall that. And also, I mean, you do want to, assuming that folks want to run the best programs they can, be most supportive of their participants, and getting that information from grievances really helps people understand where their programs might not be working and what steps they can take to improve their processes to make it more useful for their participants. So we strongly encourage all programs to have a grievance process where folks can really seek that assistance. In addition to that, there are sometimes, and we understand that termination from a continuum of care program is something that we want to do only in the most extreme instances. Obviously, we're serving highly vulnerable people. These people have had a lot of setbacks in their life. The last thing in the world we want to do is make their lives more difficult. And at the same time, we don't want to make the lives of our other participants or the lives of our staff impossible too. So there can be some times then it becomes necessary to seek to terminate participant from the program. Now, first off, if you are going to envision terminating a participant, you should start the process by, and this should be across the board, each participant, when they're entered into the program, should receive something like a participant handbook that explains what the rules and requirements are of the program and explains very clearly the circumstances under which they might be terminated from the program. You really want to give advance notice to people when they first enter your program under the circumstances under which you might ask them to have to leave your program, and they should know what those circumstances would be. If you have a person that you need to terminate, you need to basically provide them in writing the reasons why they're being terminated from the program, and those reasons should refer back to those information of the rules that you provided when they first entered into the program. Once you've notified them of their your intent to terminate from them, you must give them the opportunity to appeal that decision. Now, that appeal of the decision has got to be made to someone who is superior to the person who made the decision to terminate. So if basically the program manager made the determination that this participant needs to be terminated from their program, the appeal must go to the executive director or somebody who is senior in the organization to the program director. If the decision is made actually by the executive director, we sometimes have smaller organizations, and that will be the case. If the decision is made by the executive director to terminate a participant, then you're going to have a way in which that appeal would go to a member or a committee of the board of directors, because they would be superior to the executive director and have the authority to overrule that determination that's been made. And also because as we indicated before, you've got to provide those notice of VAWA rights and right to self-certify an incident. So you need to also, at that time of termination, the event that the circumstances surrounding the need to termination had something to do with domestic violence, you want to inform them of those rights as well. And this, basically, you need to affirm the rights to appeal the decision for everybody who exits the program, even if they have told you in advance they're voluntarily leaving to exit. They don't really need or want this assistance anymore. They don't want that case manager in their face anymore. All of that is fine, but if that is the case, you still need to inform them that they do have a right to appeal any termination decision that was made in the event they change their mind about this outcome. In addition to the rights that we've described, I think we all are aware of the fact that, well, first of all, I mean, obviously homelessness is extremely disruptive towards children, can be extremely disruptive toward their obtaining the education that they need to thrive. And therefore, there are certain educational rights that belong to all children who are experiencing homelessness. The goal is to get the children enrolled in school immediately. If there are requirements for enrolling in the school, such as vaccinations, other documentation that's required because of the educational rights that affect homeless children, that cannot be used to prevent kids from immediately enrolling in school. They have to accept them immediately. Additionally, children usually have the right to continue getting educated in their school of origin, if that is the best outcome for them, and that transportation needs to be provided to them in order to go to that school of origin. They're not required to do that. That's a personal determination by the family. They can also attend the school that is nearest to them. Obviously, transportation has always got to be provided so those students can get to school. Also, if there are things like required school uniforms and things like that, and this family does not have the resources to pay for that, they're going to be provided to the children through their educational rights under the program. And as we know, every local school district has got to have a homeless liaison, and the role of the homeless liaison is to assist both the children to be enrolled in school, but also to take advantage of these additional rights that they have. This liaison, if you click on this link, it will give you the current names of all the homeless liaisons to school districts in Rhode Island. So you can, if you don't know already, which you should, be able to access your educational liaison. Remember, you are required to appoint somebody in your organization who is responsible for ensuring that all children that are served in your organization are informed of and able to exercise their rights for educational services and how to inform them. And again, these educational rights apply both to children under the age of 18, but also to young adults ages 18 to 24. And if you've got households with children or young adults, you need to inform them of their rights under the McKinney-Vento program. These are links to two informative brochures that basically say what it is that we have said. One of them is directed towards the parents. The other one is directed to school-age youth. But basically, these are both brochures and posters. You should post these at places where you're going to have parents or children being able to see them to make sure that they are aware of the rights that they have under McKinney-Vento. Now, this is something that you might have missed because it was introduced without a great amount of fanfare, but it does potentially impact the continuum of care programs, the Build America, Buy America Act, VAWA, and basically it requires that manufactured products and iron and steel that are used in infrastructure projects need to be produced in the United States, and you have to have this Buy American preference. Now, this, for the most part, is not going to apply to most of the CoC grants that we are working with. And in the few places where it might apply, it's probably going to also apply because you've got other HUD funding that's coming into this project. For the most part, when we say things like an infrastructure project, we are talking about rehabilitation, new construction. These are the so-called eligible capital activities, eligible under the continuum of care programs. So, certainly in Rhode Island, with the exception of the CoC builds competition that we had recently, and we may have again, we do not really use continual care funding for capital purposes. So there really aren't grantees. Again, hopefully we'll have a lucky outcome under the CoC builds, NOFO, that we responded to. But in the absence of that, we don't really use CoC funds for capital purposes. And so you're not likely to trigger this requirement because you've got capital funds, because we don't really have it. Basically, it's talking about the activities that could be subject to it are, again, construction, alteration, maintenance, and repair. We know that Maintenance construction would be the capital budget line. Again, we don't really use that one, so we don't need to pay attention to it. Maintenance and repair are eligible activities under the operating cost budget line, so there is the potential there. However, very important to note, there is an exception to this, and that exception is for what they call de minimis small projects. De minimis or small can have lots of different definitions, so it's important to note that in this case, de minimis or small is $250,000 or less. So that's not that small. So if you basically have got an operating budget and you're doing all construction or maintenance, say for example, you've got a facility where you want to do, you've got some sort of facility and you want to do some renovations to the bathroom facilities to make them more accessible, for example, as long as the cost of that maintenance or repair item, the total project cost of making that bathroom accessible is less than $250,000, it is going to be exempted because it is below the de minimis level. It's only when it rises above that level that you're going to pay attention to it. For the most part, the size of the operating budgets are really always going to be below that de minimis line. So highly unlikely that most CoC grants will run afoul to it. Also note this date of 8/23/2024. Basically, if you have a grant that basically was executed before that date, it's not going to apply to your grant either. And many of these grants were executed well before 8/23/24. So again, this is a requirement, but unlikely that most of our CoC grants are ever going to become a large enough infrastructure project to actually trigger this requirement. But you should, by the way, if you've got procurement regulations, if you've got contracts for capital repairs and things like that, you are required to put this Buy American preference language into your agreements, and this is the language that you are supposed to include in your agreements. And then also, if you've got written procurement policies and procedures, you should take a look at them and make sure that you update them and you include within them the requirements for the Buy American preference. Again, for the most part, although if it does apply, you need to document all these compliance, but for the most part, you're not going to be running into this requirement. As I said, it really does require a maintenance or repair thing that's going to exceed that de minimis level of $250,000. There are various quick guides and references to get more information about this requirement, so you can maintain your knowledge on that. But wait, there are more policies. So let's take a look at what some of these other ones are. So, I mean, needless to say, you want to respect the confidentiality of the people that we're working with. Basically, people have suffered a lot of indignities in these programs, and having their personal business out there for everyone to see is the last thing that people need. So you really want to make sure that your participant records are kept secure. You know this, I mean, the basics. I mean, if you've got written files, written participant files, you want to make sure they're kept in a locked filing cabinet. You don't want to have a whole mess of participant files lying out on your desk. You want to leave them lying on your desk and go for a break or anything like that. If you're going off to lunch and you've got participant files, you want to put them back in the locked file cabinet and lock that file cabinet so people can see it. There are also the HIPAA privacy protections that really have to do much more with healthcare providers. But if you are a healthcare provider and you fall subject to it, the HIPAA compliance is even more strenuous than the requirements in the continuum care. Anything, again, you just do want to make sure that you are keeping participants' information as confidential as you possibly can. There has forever been a requirement that you maintain a drug-free workplace. You demonstrate your requirements for the drug-free workplace by having a notice, as you can see on the slide here, that there is a drug-free workplace. You again have to publish statement that it is unlawful for folks to do all these things with illegal substances. And in addition to that, you need to, by the way, if you've got an employee of your organization that's funded under these fund things, you must notice that should in the unfortunate event, should that employee be arrested for some drug-related activity, they are required to notify you in writing that that has occurred, and they need to tell you as soon as possible, within 5 calendar days of having been convicted of a drug-related offense. And not only that, but you have to then, if you are notified that one of your employees has been arrested for a drug-related or convicted of a drug-related offense, you've got to notify HUD and other federal funders within 10 calendar days of being notified of that. And basically, you are expected as well to maintain that drug-free environment. You should establish a ongoing drug-free awareness program to inform employees about these dangers and the policies of maintaining it, and access to services and the penalties that could be imposed. And obviously, it's not just drugs. Alcohol is extremely problematic, and you don't want people to be using any substances in the course of their work environment. Folks are aware of the fact that HUD requires that all organizations that receive funds from it must have a code of conduct on file. The code of conduct really has to do with conflicts of interest and ensuring that the benefits of the HUD assistance really are only going to participants, that the only benefit that employees get from these assistants is the salary that they receive for doing their jobs. Basically, every organization has got to have their organization's code of conduct on file. HUD has got a very useful, on their website, useful information about how to establish and write that code of conduct. Just go Google HUD code of conduct, and they will lead you to these forms that you need to comply. There is this code of conduct e-library. You can click on this link here. Your organization, when you click on that link, you should find on HUD's Code of Conduct e-library your organization's code of conduct. In the event that it is not on HUD's website, you really do want to follow this link, minimum requirements and submission instructions, to assure that your code of conduct is on file with HUD. HUD will not enter into a contract with an organization that does not have that code of conduct on file. So in the event that it's not there, or the other thing that happens, and we've seen this happen, is HUD periodically will go in and basically update that library. These things go out of date, and you would have had a code of conduct on file, but it may no longer be, it may need to be updated, and you will need to basically resubmit your code of conduct for HUD. Again, it's critical both in terms of ensuring that your agency's operations are fully compliant, but as important, if you do not have that available on the HUD website, HUD will not enter a contract with you. Conflict of interest is an important thing. Remember, basically, it is when there's a conflict between the participants' basically duties as an employee of your organization and other obligations they have. Basically, if you had, for example, if you had a member of your staff who actually happens to own a rental unit and a participant might want to use that rental unit, well, there you've got a situation where everything that has to do with that rental unit has got to be done by someone different. Any housing quality inspection that you're doing, any rent reasonableness determination cannot be done by anyone who has an interest in that. We see it all the time, by the way. It's not unusual for housing authorities to actually own housing that they in turn rent out to eligible participants. But when that is the case, even when it's a housing authority involved, if they're the owner of it, they cannot inspect their own unit. They cannot do their own rent reasonableness determination. In those circumstances, a housing authority itself has got to contract with an outside entity to do that for it. Plus the fact these financial benefits occur not only during the course of employment, but also extend for a full year after that employment is being completed. We often see that people understand these conflict of interest requirements when folks are directly employed, but they do not necessarily understand that that prohibition runs for a full year after the employment has ended. So make sure your policies do say that, and you are protecting against that. You're also expected to have written standards for all assistance that you provide. The CoC has written standards for assistance. Basically, what you expect to do as a provider agency is to formally adopt and have as your agency's written standards, the standards that are provided by the CoC. You're allowed to adopt those, and you're allowed to amend them a little to add into your agency's specific policies, as long as, of course, they're consistent with the CoC requirements and HUD requirements. So, but you really should have, every agency that's got HUD CoC funding should have in their policies and procedures their written standards for the provision of assistance to participants. Another thing that you need to have policies and procedures for is the rent reasonableness determination. Remember, if you're using rental assistance, the maximum rent that you can pay is the reasonable rent. If you're providing housing assistance using leasing, the maximum that you can pay is the lesser of the fair market rent or the reasonable rent. So if you're using leasing, the fair market rent is the maximum rent that you can pay. If you're using rental assistance, the reasonable rent is the maximum that you can pay. But in order to do that, therefore, you've got to have written policies and procedures for how you make those determinations that the rent is reasonable. So how it is you document comparable rents, how you determine the rent is reasonableness, and how you have that demonstrate that in your case files. Remember, any participant who's receiving assistance, either as tenant-based rental assistance or any kind of rental assistance or leasing assistance, that participant file must include a rent reasonableness determination, or else it will not be possible to determine whether or not you paid the correct amount of rent on behalf of that participant. So we've got linkages to resources that help understand how rent reasonableness and fair market rents interplay. I just described them a little, and also what a rent reasonableness certification looks like. So very important, critical factor to have that rent reasonableness. Additionally, you are expected to have in writing the intake procedures that in order to get people into your program. HUD always wants you to have, wherever possible, third-party documentation that demonstrates that people are eligible for assistance. That documentation can take the form of letters from shelters or outreach teams or other service providers. HMIS, of course, is a great source of third-party documentation of eligibility. If we don't have it from third-party, then we can do observations of those intake workers, but we've got to have a justification as to why it is that we're based our eligibility determination on our intake worker observation. And also we want to, again, wherever possible, still be able to try and get that third-party documentation. In limited circumstances, you can admit a participant to your program solely based on self-certification. But if you're doing that, you really want to show that you've made repeated efforts to get third-party or other kinds of documentation for it before you're accepting that self-certification. But again, you don't want to allow or force people to remain homeless just because we cannot get the appropriate documentation. We do want to give assistance to people wherever we can. Okay, I think we've got a Zoom poll here. So the first one, which of these is a conflict of interest? An employee conducts a housing quality inspection on a unit owned by their agency. A project rents units from an employee's son. An agency uses an employee's catering business to provide meals at a program site, or all of the above. That's question number one. Question number two, which is a violation of client confidentiality? Sharing an interesting story about a client with a coworker, sharing information with a colleague about a client to coordinate services, having a list of clients posted on your bulletin board by your desk, leaving a client file open on your desk while you step away. You can answer more than one of these as being a violation of client confidentiality, but we encourage you to answer these two poll questions, and then we will take a look at the results. Got some responses. I think this is sort of the number that we're getting. So I think, Rosa, we can move along, close the poll, and see what it looks like. Hold on, let's see what I can see. Oh, wait. I looked at the wrong one, sorry. Oh. Have I seen the results yet?
No, there's 4 responses. I'll close it.
Okay.
Oh,
Okay,
that's
great. Great. Sorry. Okay, so 75% of all of those constitute a conflict of interest, and overwhelmingly you got the fact that those are all the kinds of activities you can't do an inspection on a unit owned by the agency. You shouldn't rent units from relatives, and you can't really gain other benefits by having your catering business also gain income from it. Which of these is a violation? Well, actually, certainly you both said sharing an interesting story about a client. That would be a conflict of interest, that you really don't share interesting information about our clients. You don't want to have their names posted in a publicly available setting, so that's correct. Leaving a client's file on your desk is a violation of confidentiality. That middle one, sharing information with a colleague about a client to coordinate services, probably is not a violation of confidentiality because you're sharing it for a legitimate program purpose of ensuring that you're coordinating services appropriately for the clients. So good job, everybody. You overwhelmingly got these things correct. Now, there are some other administrative requirements that we're going to go through. So you need to, basically, we're talking about the stuff that you should keep in all of your participant files. You should, in your participant files, keep information about the services that are provided. You want to have those case notes that show that you were engaged in it. You're going to want to, by the way, we do always say that we should have some record of the time that folks are spending working on continuum of care activities. There are basically two ways we look at that. We look both at their time records, basically what it is they're reporting that they're worked, but we also want to look at case files, because basically if we're saying, if someone is reporting that they spent 8 hours on Monday, the 4th of August doing case management, then we want to be able in their case notes to show that there were case notes that happened that day, that they actually did work, they reviewed a file, they were doing activities, and that activities are shown in the case record. So it's both an hourly log, and also we should be able to use case notes and other things to demonstrate the facts we're actually doing the work that they were reporting they were doing on their timesheets. Also remember, the regulations require that you are at least doing an annual assessment of service needs. So every case file should show an assessment of service needs that's completed at least annually, but it can certainly be completed more frequently than annually, but it has to happen. You know that every unit must be inspected at least annually. We're making reference here to the housing quality standards. You're also probably all aware of the fact that one of these days we're going to be switching from the HUD's housing quality standards to the new Inspire standards. Right now, the date that they're supposed to be in effect is October the 1st, but HUD has pushed that back multiple times. We're still awaiting guidance from HUD on how to implement those Inspire standards for the CoC and ESG programs. Expect that as soon as that guidance is received from HUD, we will be doing some training, or the Rhode Island Continuum of Care will be doing some training for you to know how you implement those standards. You are, by the way, allowed to use the Inspire standards now if you're familiar with them, but you're not required to do so until HUD mandates that you are indeed required to do so. Also, remember, in addition to the inspections of units on an annual basis, if your project is serving children under the age of 6, or you've got pregnant women, remember you are required to do a visual assessment for the possibility of lead-based paint hazards, and you need to have that the outcome of that visual assessment in your client's record as well. I talked about rent reasonableness as well. Again, anytime you're using rental assistance or leasing funds, you must have in your participant file a rent reasonableness determination, as well as the housing quality or Inspire program inspection. Any record that you have pertaining to the use of CoC funds must be maintained for a minimum of 5 years. Basically, it is the 5 years after the end date of the last grant period. That's how long you have to maintain it. Basically, for eligibility documentation, as long as you keep them for at least 7 years, after which the participant has been discharged from the program, you're going to be in fine shape. Back in the day, of course, these were all physical records. It become somewhat burdensome on agencies to maintain, file cabinets in perpetuity. They take up space, they get old. So that's why there was the provision to basically be able to delete those records after a period of time. If they're all electronic, there is no requirement, and they really don't take additional storage space. There is no requirement that you not maintain that for longer than these periods of time, but you must maintain it for at least these minimum periods of time. Additionally, you are required to maintain an organizational chart of your organization, and that organizational chart basically, again, has to show the lines of authority, who reports to who is the supervisor, and also there need to be written job descriptions for all positions that are funded with Continuum of Care program funds. So make sure that you have those job descriptions and an organizational chart as well. So this coming soon indicates that, fortunately, we're coming to the end of the administrative requirements on this. We've got a session coming up on the 20th, which is, I guess, 2 weeks from tomorrow, at 10 a.m. in the morning on Wednesday, which we're going to have all the exciting fiscal issues. This one is targeted more towards your organization's fiscal staff and your executive leadership, not necessarily the case management and other direct client staff for your program. But these are the topics that we're going to be covering. Like all of our sessions, it will be recorded. So if you're unable to attend it, it will be on the Continuum of Care's website, so you can access it there. To get an idea of additional trainings that are coming up, not all the trainings under this program are provided by our organization. To get an idea of all the upcoming trainings, you've got this link here. And also there have been a number of trainings that we and our partner organizations have provided. They have been recorded. And so this is where you can click on this link to gain access to where those trainings are located. So now that sort of concludes our formal presentation. So we can ask you whether there are any questions, suggestions that you have for us. We are here for you. These are how you can access our great staff. I couldn't help but notice that Sarah listed 8 pets, which is definitely the record, or at least 8 pet names. So she is the reigning champion and a highly competitive pet fancier marketplace here.
Yes, I do have 8 pets. That is correct.
Are they kitty cats?
5 of them are cats and 3 of them are dogs.
You are the no holds barred champion.
Woohoo! Thank you. I accept my title with honor.
Howard, I have a question.
Sure.
I seem to always be the only one that asks questions.
No, that's why you're our favorite.
So going back to the VAWA new line item that we have and the monitoring compliance with confidentiality protections.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, like, you mentioned that pertains a lot to like people that are organizations that are maintaining HMIS. If we, as an organization that doesn't use HMIS, we have EmpowerDB, would that then include like some of our staff time to maintain our EmpowerDB database and the confidentiality that provides?
Oh, good. Well, let's put back up.
Way back there.
Yeah, here we go. So these are the specific things that HUD says: monitoring, evaluating compliance, training on confidentiality requirements. So I think, maybe that certainly we're talking about providing training for the staff on how you implement that to make sure it is confidential, reporting on it. Lauren, do you have thoughts on this?
I think if it's generally your comparable database expenses are going to be funded on the HMIS budget line item, right? So you can have an HMIS budget line item in your grant, And that
We
most
can.
of those expenses, you can have a HMIS budget.
Even
line
though
item.
okay, because I don't
Yeah,
think
'cause
we
it's the
never
comparable
have
system.
because we didn't have HMIS. So.
Yeah, but I think I'm not, I will double check this
Okay.
person after we close here and reach out to you somehow through Rosa if I'm wrong about that, but I'm 99% certain that comparable database expenses are also eligible on the HMIS budget line item.
Okay,
So if you
thanks. That
don't
would be
hear
great
back
to
from
know.
me, it is.
Yeah.
Okay,
Because otherwise, how would you, I mean, you're required to do
Yeah.
it. So how would you be able to meet that requirement?
Right. Okay. That's great to know. Yeah, that would be good to know. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, and this is how, in the event that you need to reach us, this is how you do it. Also, you probably have noticed in the chat, hopefully you noticed in the chat that our colleague Sarah has posted a link which will allow you to do a quick survey to give us some feedback on what we have and how we have provided this information to you today so that we can do a better job in the future.
Yeah, and that survey is also an opportunity for you all to provide feedback on other trainings that you like, topics that we haven't covered and that you would like for us to cover in the future. So we would appreciate any feedback. Thank you.
Well, not hearing further questions, I think this is the time for us to thank you very warmly for spending time with us this morning. It's still summer. It's still yet to issue a NOFO, which means we can briefly, perhaps breathe a little easier. So I encourage all of you to embrace your pets, embrace the beach, embrace our remaining days of summer. And we'll have lots more work to do in the not too distant future. So I think at this, we'll wrap it up and thank you very much. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Good to see you.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.